Garrett had spent most of his life surrounded by broken things. Broken rifles, cracked hull plating, dented helmets, shattered servo joints. In a war that stretched across star systems, someone always needed something repaired. Ships came limping into orbital docks like wounded animals, and soldiers arrived carrying armor that looked as though it had been chewed on by asteroids. To Garrett, however, it was all just work. He liked work. Work made sense. Metal had rules. Circuits behaved logically. If something broke, you found the fault and fixed it. Simple. People, on the other hand, were far more complicated. The armory aboard the Coalition station Vanguard Reach hummed quietly with machines as Garrett leaned over his workbench. Magnetic clamps held a curved plate of alien alloy in place, while tiny repair drones buzzed around it like polite metal insects. Garrett wiped his hands on a rag and squinted at the damage. "Well," he muttered, "whatever hit you was definitely angry." The armor plate in front of him was not human design. The alloy shimmered faintly with deep violet tones beneath the surface, almost like light was trapped inside it. The dent running across it looked as if a meteor had tried to introduce itself at high speed. One of the drones chirped irritably. "Yes, yes," Garrett said, waving a screwdriver at it. "I see the structural stress. I'm working on it. You don't need to judge me." Repairing alien technology had become common since the Alliance formed, but some pieces still made Garrett uneasy. Not because they were dangerous, because they felt important. This armor definitely felt important. It had arrived an hour earlier carried by 4 silent alien soldiers who looked as though smiling might be illegal in their culture. They had placed the armor on the bench with extreme care, then stood watching Garrett like statues. Finally, one of them had said only one sentence. "Handle it carefully, human." Then they left. Garrett tapped the armor thoughtfully. "Very helpful instructions," he said aloud, "because normally I just repair things by throwing them out the airlock." The drones ignored him. He activated a scanning wand and slowly passed it across the surface. Data scrolled across the holographic display beside the bench. Energy channels, reinforcement layers, micro-fractures along the edges. But what caught Garrett's attention were the markings. Thin engraved lines curved along the inside edge of the armor plate. Symbols written in the elegant script of the alien empire. He leaned closer. Huh. The symbols were not decorative. They were names, dozens of them. Each one carefully carved into the metal, small but deliberate. Some of them had tiny marks beside them. Perhaps dates, perhaps something else. Garrett scratched his beard. "Okay. Either this armor has a long ownership history," he said, "or it's been collecting signatures like a celebrity autograph board." He gently rotated the plate under the lights. The surface carried scars from old battles. Some of them had been repaired before, but others were left untouched, preserved like memories etched into metal. The armor felt old, not fragile, far from it, but ancient in the way a mountain feels ancient, like it had seen more history than anyone currently alive. Garrett picked up a polishing tool and began carefully cleaning a damaged ridge along the chest plate. "This thing's been through hell," he murmured. "Whoever owns it either refuses to retire or has a terrible sense of self-preservation." The repair drones hummed quietly while he worked. For several minutes, the workshop filled only with the soft buzz of machinery and the occasional click of Garrett's tools. Then a voice behind him spoke. "She refuses to retire." Garrett froze. He slowly turned around. Standing in the doorway was someone he immediately recognized, even though he had never seen her in person before. The alien queen was taller than he expected. Her posture carried effortless authority, but there was something calm about her presence that didn't feel threatening. At first glance, she looked human. Her skin was pale and smooth, her expression sharp and observant. Long, dark hair flowed over her shoulders, but her ears were long and elegantly curved backward, unmistakably marking her as one of the ruling species of the Empire. Queen Wraith stepped into the workshop. Garrett blinked once, then twice. "Okay," he said slowly, "either I accidentally inhaled too many repair fumes, or the queen of an entire star empire just walked into my maintenance room." Wraith stopped beside the workbench. Her eyes moved to the armor beneath Garrett's hands. She spoke quietly. "Neither assumption is incorrect, human." Garrett considered this. Well, he said, I appreciate the honesty. Wraith watched as he continued holding the polishing tool against the armor plate. Her gaze shifted briefly to his hands. Then she leaned slightly closer. Her voice dropped to a soft whisper. Human, you are currently touching a queen. Garrett stared at her, then slowly looked down at the armor, then back at her. He sighed. You know, he said calmly, that sentence would have been extremely useful about 10 minutes earlier. For a moment, Wraith simply looked at him. Then unexpectedly she laughed. The sound echoed lightly through the quiet workshop, while Garrett shook his head and returned to polishing the armor. Well, he muttered, guess I should start charging royal service fees. Garrett had repaired many dangerous things in his life, but repairing something while its owner stood 2 steps away, watching every movement, was a new category of pressure. He tried very hard not to think about the fact that the owner in question ruled several star systems and commanded fleets large enough to block out suns. Instead, he focused on the armor. The chest plate rested under the white glow of the workshop lamps while Garrett slowly adjusted the settings on his microwelder. The violet alloy responded carefully to heat, the surface rippling like liquid glass before settling again into smooth metal. Behind him, Queen Wraith remained silent. Not the impatient silence of someone waiting, the curious silence of someone observing. Garrett cleared his throat. You're making this slightly stressful, you know? Wraith tilted her head slightly. Her long ears shifted with the motion. Stressful? Yes, Garrett said, not looking away from the armor. Normally, when I repair something, the owner is either unconscious, very far away, or trying to shoot someone. Wraith folded her arms calmly. And my presence disrupts this process? Garrett adjusted a tool. Let's just say if I accidentally scratch the armor of a random soldier, they complain. He glanced over his shoulder. If I scratch yours, I'm guessing entire fleets arrive. Wraith considered this. That would depend on the size of the scratch. Garrett stared at her for a moment. That was not the comforting answer I was hoping for. Wraith's lips curved slightly. Garrett returned to the armor before he said something that might accidentally start an interstellar incident. The repair drones floated around the armor, scanning its surface with quiet pulses of blue light. One of them projected a holographic map of the damage. Garrett studied the display. Interesting. Wraith stepped closer. What do you see? Garrett tapped the hologram. This armor has been repaired a lot. Wraith did not answer immediately. Garrett rotated the display and zoomed in on the internal structure. Different metals, he continued. Different reinforcement techniques. Some of these repairs are centuries old. He pointed at a section of the inner plating. And this part was deliberately preserved instead of replaced. Wraith's eyes followed his finger. Yes. Garrett crouched slightly and examined the inner engraving again. Now that he knew whose armor it was, the symbols suddenly felt heavier. These name, he said quietly. Wraith nodded. They were queens. Garrett slowly leaned back. All of them? Yes. Garrett stared at the armor again, processing the information. So let me get this straight, he said carefully. This armor has been worn by every ruler before you. Wraith's voice was calm. Yes. Garrett rubbed his face with both hands. I should have called in sick today. Wraith looked mildly confused. You are unwell? No, Garrett said. But I would have preferred to learn I had a mild cold instead of discovering I'm currently responsible for repairing the most historically important piece of clothing in your entire civilization. Wraith studied him with quiet interest. You are doing well so far. Garrett pointed at the armor. This chest plate alone probably has more political significance than my entire species. Wraith paused. That is unlikely. Garrett sighed. Thank you for the encouragement. He leaned forward again and gently ran the scanning wand across a deep scar near the shoulder. The holographic display flickered. That's a blade strike, Garrett said. Wraith nodded once. 211 years ago. Garrett froze. You remember the exact year? Wraith looked at the armor. It is difficult to forget the year your grandmother died. Garrett slowly lowered the scanner. For a moment, the workshop fell quiet except for the soft hum of the drones. Garrett glanced at the engraved names again. Your grandmother wore this? Yes? Garrett exhaled slowly. Well, That definitely raises the emotional difficulty level of my job. Wraith's expression softened slightly. You do not seem afraid. Garrett shrugged. Oh, I'm definitely afraid. He pointed at the armor. I'm just more afraid of damaging the repair process. Wraith studied him for a moment. You treat it carefully. Garrett adjusted the welder again. Metal deserves respect. Wraith raised an eyebrow. Even metal belonging to a queen? Garrett grinned slightly. Especially metal belonging to a queen. He paused. Because if I mess up ordinary armor, someone complains. He gestured around the room. If I mess up yours, historians will probably write books about the idiot human who destroyed centuries of royal tradition. Wraith suddenly laughed again. The sound was quiet but genuine. Garrett blinked. I'm glad you find my potential historical disgrace amusing. Wraith stepped closer to the armor. Her fingers brushed lightly across one of the old scars Garrett had not repaired. You did not remove this damage. Garrett shook his head. Nope. Why? Garrett looked at her like the answer was obvious. Because someone earned that scratch. Wraith was silent. Garrett continued polishing the metal carefully. Armor tells stories, he said. If you erase all the damage, it stops telling them. Wraith looked at him. For the first time since entering the workshop, the queen seemed slightly surprised. Garrett leaned back in his chair and examined his work. Well, he said, good news. Wraith waited. The armor is repairable. She said nothing. Garrett pointed at the engraving again. Bad news is I'm now emotionally invested in protecting about 200 years of royal history. Wraith's eyes gleamed faintly with amusement. That responsibility belongs to me. Garrett shrugged. Yeah, but I'm the one holding the screwdriver. Wraith looked down at the armor again. For the first time in many years, someone was touching it not with ceremony, but with understanding. The workshop lights dimmed slightly as the station rotated into the shadow of the nearby gas giant. Through the long observation window behind the workbench, a river of stars slowly slid across the darkness of space. Garrett barely noticed. His entire attention was focused on the armor in front of him. Repairing it had turned into something far more complicated than he expected. The outer plating was ancient, layered with alloys that modern engineers no longer produced. The inner structure contained micro-actuators and nerve-linked channels designed to respond directly to the wearer's movements. Whoever had first built the suit had not intended it to survive centuries, yet here it was, stubbornly continuing its existence through repair after repair. Garrett adjusted a micro tool and leaned closer. Okay, that is definitely not standard circuitry. A tiny repair drone hovered near his shoulder and projected a rotating schematic of the armor's interior. Garrett frowned. These power channels are routed through 3 different energy systems, he said. Why would anyone design something this complicated? Wraith, who had been standing quietly beside the bench for several minutes, answered calmly. Because the first queen who wore it refused to die. Garrett slowly turned his head. That sounds like a story. Wraith folded her hands behind her back. The original armor failed during the Battle of Varel. The queen survived long enough to command the evacuation of an entire city. Afterward, the engineers rebuilt the suit so it could continue functioning, even if parts of it were destroyed. Garrett whistled softly. So this thing has backup systems for its backup systems? Yes. He tapped one glowing conduit with the tip of his tool. Well, good news is the design is brilliant. Wraith waited. Garrett sighed. Bad news is whoever designed it clearly hated future repair technicians. Wraith tilted her head. You are frustrated. Garrett pointed inside the armor. These energy regulators are older than half the civilizations in this quadrant. He leaned back in his chair. If I disconnect the wrong line, the entire suit might decide it no longer believes in physics. Wraith looked thoughtfully at the armor. That would be inconvenient. Garrett stared at her. Inconvenient? Yes. Garrett rubbed his temples. I feel like our definitions of inconvenience are very different. The repair drones continued scanning the armor while Garrett studied the deeper layers of the suit. Inside the chest section, he discovered something he had not noticed before, a circular housing surrounding a crystalline core that pulsed faintly with blue light. He blinked. Okay, that is definitely interesting. Wraith stepped closer. What is it? Garrett pointed at the crystal. Power heart. Wraith nodded. It synchronizes with the nervous system of the wearer. Garrett raised an eyebrow. So the armor literally listens to your body? Yes. Garrett leaned closer, fascinated. The crystal was not purely mechanical. It had organic lattice structures inside it, something between technology and biology. That explains the responsiveness, he murmured, but it also means this thing probably hates strangers poking at it. As if offended by his statement, the crystal suddenly pulsed brighter. Garrett immediately pulled his tool back. Yep, definitely hates strangers. Wraith looked mildly amused. It is reacting to your presence. Garrett glanced at her. Well, tell it to relax. I'm trying to help. The crystal dimmed again. Garrett stared at it suspiciously. Did it actually listen to you? Wraith's expression remained calm. It recognizes authority. Garrett nodded slowly. Of course it does. Even your armor has a chain of command. He leaned back down and resumed working carefully around the crystal housing. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the soft clicks of Garrett's tools and the quiet hum of the drones. Then Garrett suddenly stopped. Huh. Wraith looked at him. What is it? Garrett pointed at a long scar across the inner plating. That mark goes deeper than the others. Wraith stepped closer. Her eyes rested on the damage. That one is recent. Garrett scanned it with a handheld analyzer. Plasma strike. Yes. Garrett glanced up at her. You were wearing the armor when that happened, weren't you? Wraith did not answer immediately. Garrett read the silence correctly. Well, he said slowly, I'm glad the armor works. Wraith's voice remained calm. My people expect their queen to stand with them. Garrett shrugged. My species usually expects leaders to hide behind very large desks. Wraith's eyebrow lifted slightly. That seems inefficient. Garrett laughed. On the contrary, desks are excellent defensive structures. Wraith studied him curiously. You joke often. Garrett tightened a screw along the energy conduit. That's because if I don't joke, I start thinking about the fact that I'm currently repairing armor that has survived more battles than my entire career. Wraith looked at the suit again. The armor carries memory. Garrett nodded. Yeah, I noticed. He gently brushed a cloth over one of the engraved names. You ever think about how strange it is? He asked. Wraith glanced at him. How? Garrett gestured toward the armor. All these rulers, all these wars, all these victories and losses. He tapped the metal lightly. And now the whole story is sitting on a repair bench while a tired human with coffee stains on his sleeve fixes it. Wraith's eyes flickered with amusement. You are not tired. Garrett lifted his mug from the table and showed the empty bottom. I ran out of coffee 20 minutes ago. That means I'm entering a very dangerous emotional state. Wraith looked puzzled. What state? Garrett placed the mug down dramatically. The state where engineers start making creative decisions. Wraith blinked once. Then, to Garrett's great satisfaction, she laughed again. The sound echoed softly through the quiet workshop, while the ancient armor rested between them, its scars illuminated by the gentle glow of distant stars. The station had completed another slow rotation when Garrett finally straightened his back and stretched his arms. Several joints in his shoulders produced quiet pops that sounded like small mechanical failures. Good news, he muttered to the armor. My spine still functions. The armor, as usual, did not respond. The workshop lights reflected across its curved plates, revealing fresh seams where Garrett had already repaired several structural fractures. Tiny repair drones drifted lazily through the air, occasionally projecting diagnostic grids over the armor, like glowing spiderwebs. Queen Wraith had not left. She had moved only once in the last hour, shifting from the far side of the room to stand closer beside the workbench. Now she watched Garrett's work with the kind of focused calm that made him slightly nervous. Not because she was intimidating, because she was paying attention. Garrett lifted a small grav driver and carefully loosened a locking ring around the shoulder joint. You know, he said, most important people I've met prefer not to stare directly at the person holding tools near their vital equipment. Wraith tilted her head slightly. Why? Garrett glanced up briefly. Because if the technician gets nervous, the technician's hands shake. Wraith looked down at his hands. They are not shaking. Garrett tightened the driver again. That's because I've entered what we call the professional panic phase. Wraith considered that. Is that dangerous? Extremely, Garrett said. This is the stage where engineers become very calm while internally screaming. Wraith watched him silently for a moment before her lips curved faintly. Garrett continued adjusting the shoulder mechanism. The joint rotated with a soft magnetic hum as he lifted the plate free from the frame. Beneath it, delicate arrays of micro-actuators revealed themselves like the muscles of some mechanical creature. He whistled quietly. Now that, he said, is impressive. Wraith stepped closer. The armor responded almost immediately. Soft lines of light traveled along the metal, as if recognizing her presence. Garrett noticed. See, that's unfair, he said. I've been working on this thing for hours and it barely acknowledges me. Wraith rested her hand lightly against the edge of the workbench. It recognizes its ruler. Garrett nodded thoughtfully. Yeah, well, my wrench recognizes me and still refuses to cooperate half the time. He leaned closer to the exposed joint and carefully adjusted a cluster of energy filaments. These control fibers are ancient, he murmured, but they're beautifully engineered. Wraith watched the movement of his hands. You treat it gently. Garrett shrugged. Metal remembers how it's treated. Wraith raised an eyebrow slightly. You speak of metal as if it is alive. Garrett paused. Well, maybe not alive. He tapped the inner framework. But this suit has personality. Wraith looked intrigued. Explain. Garrett pointed at a tiny ridge along the joint housing. See that adjustment? Someone changed the angle decades ago. Yes. That wasn't a factory modification. That was a battlefield repair. Wraith nodded once. My mother. Garrett grinned faintly. Thought so. He gently rotated the actuator ring and resealed it with a thin layer of bonding alloy. Your family has been modifying this armor like a shared project car. Wraith blinked. I do not know what that means. Garrett chuckled. It means every generation adds something new and no one remembers what the original design looked like. Wraith studied the armor thoughtfully. That is accurate. Garrett stepped back and activated the diagnostic grid again. A holographic silhouette of the armor appeared above the table, glowing in shifting layers of blue and gold. Several sections flickered red. Garrett sighed. Well, that's less encouraging. Wraith looked at the display. What is wrong? Garrett pointed to the torso region. The internal stress channels are overloaded. Wraith frowned slightly. Can you repair them? Garrett rubbed his chin. Technically, yes. Wraith waited. Garrett pointed to the deep lines of damage running through the inner plating. But whoever wore this armor last was pushing it way past its safe limits. Wraith's voice remained calm. That was me. Garrett looked at her for a moment. Of course it was. He leaned forward again and began disassembling the inner plating. You ever consider the revolutionary idea of not getting shot at? Wraith folded her arms. My people are at war. Garrett nodded. Fair point. He removed another section of plating and examined a long burn mark along the inner frame. That plasma strike almost pierced the core. Wraith remained silent. Garrett shook his head. You know, if this suit had failed, your entire empire would have a very complicated political problem. Wraith looked at him. My people would choose another queen. Garrett paused. Yeah, he said slowly, but they'd probably miss this one. Wraith did not respond. Garrett reinstalled the plating and tightened the final seal with careful precision. The armor hummed softly as the system synchronized again. He leaned back in his chair and studied it. You know what's strange? He said after a moment. Wraith looked at him. For something that's been through centuries of war, Garrett continued, this armor still works beautifully. Wraith stepped closer and rested her hand lightly against the chest plate. It survives because it must. Garrett nodded slowly. Yeah. He picked up a polishing cloth and began wiping the surface again. Well, he said casually, let's make sure it survives a few more centuries. Wraith watched him in silence. For the first time in many years, someone was not looking at the armor with reverence. They were simply taking care of it, and somehow, that felt even more respectful. Garrett did not notice how much time had passed until the station lights shifted from white to the softer blue that signaled the artificial evening cycle. The change washed over the workshop slowly, like twilight drifting through a mechanical forest. He blinked at the clock projected on the far wall. Now that can't be right. One of the repair drones chirped. Garrett pointed accusingly at it. You didn't tell me 6 hours passed. The drone chirped again, sounding suspiciously smug. Across the workbench, Queen Wraith remained exactly where she had been standing, her attention resting on the armor as if the hours meant nothing at all. Garrett leaned back in his chair and stretched again, his spine producing another series of mechanical pops. Okay, he said. New rule. Wraith looked at him. What rule? If I'm repairing royal artifacts for half a day straight, someone is legally required to bring snacks. Wraith tilted her head. Snacks? Garrett nodded seriously. Yes, preferably something that does not glow, explode, or attempt to eat me. Wraith considered this. My people do not traditionally bring food into armories. Garrett sighed. That explains why engineers are always tired. He returned to the armor and gently lifted the central torso plate. The inner frame shimmered beneath the workshop lights, revealing layers of crystalline conduits and energy pathways that pulse slowly like the veins of a living organism. Garrett studied the structure with narrowed eyes. You know, he muttered, this suit is starting to feel like it has opinions. Wraith's expression remained calm. It does. Garrett paused. You're joking. No. Garrett slowly looked back at the glowing power core embedded within the armor. The blue crystal pulsed once, then again. Garrett pointed at it. See? That right there is why humans become suspicious of alien technology. Wraith stepped closer. The core responds to emotional and neurological signals. Garrett rubbed his chin. So if you're angry, the armor reacts? Yes. Garrett leaned back slightly. And if I annoy you? Wraith looked at him. That depends on how much. Garrett glanced at the crystal again. Good to know. He carefully adjusted one of the energy regulators surrounding the core. The crystal flickered brighter as the systems recalibrated. Suddenly, the armor produced a low harmonic tone that vibrated through the workbench. Garrett froze. Okay. The tone deepened slightly. Garrett slowly lowered his tool. That sound seems important. Wraith watched the armor closely. It is synchronizing. With what? Wraith looked at him. Me. Garrett blinked once, then twice. You mean the armor knows you're nearby? Yes. Garrett leaned back in his chair and stared at the suit. So let me summarize this situation. Wraith waited patiently. I'm repairing an ancient suit of royal armor, Garrett continued, counting on his fingers, that contains centuries of history, a semi-organic power core, emotional feedback systems, and apparently the ability to recognize its queen from across the room. Wraith nodded once. Garrett folded his hands. Excellent. Wraith's eyebrow lifted slightly. Excellent. Garrett pointed at the armor. Because now I know if I break something, it will personally report me. Wraith did not answer immediately. Then her shoulders moved slightly with quiet laughter. Garrett returned to work, removing a damaged control filament from the inner frame. The filament was no thicker than a strand of hair, but carried enormous energy loads between the armor systems. He held it up to the light. This piece is burned out. Wraith stepped closer. From battle? Garrett nodded. Looks like the armor diverted extra power to the shielding systems. Wraith said nothing. Garrett replaced the filament with a new one and carefully sealed it into the control channel. Your armor saved your life, he said casually. Wraith's voice was quiet. Yes. Garrett reactivated the system. The crystal pulsed once more, brighter than before, and the energy lines across the armor lit briefly like constellations forming across the metal. Garrett watched the glow with fascination. You know, he said, I've repaired war machines, starship reactors, and once a cargo robot that tried to unionize. Wraith looked at him. Unionize. Long story, he pointed at the armor. But this is something else. Wraith placed her hand gently against the chest plate. It carries our history. Garrett nodded slowly. Yeah. He polished a small section of the metal again. And now it also carries a very nervous human technician. Wraith studied his reflection in the armor's surface. You are not nervous, Garrett shrugged. Let's call it respectful panic. Wraith smiled faintly. The armor rested between them, glowing softly beneath the evening lights of the station, its ancient scars shining quietly, like the memory of distant wars. And for the first time in centuries, the armor was not only preparing for battle, it was being understood. Garrett discovered something strange about the armor during the next stage of repairs. The deeper he went into its structure, the more it felt less like machinery and more like a carefully layered history book written in metal. He slid a thin diagnostic probe along the inner framework and watched the holographic display bloom into life above the workbench. Blue lines traced power channels, golden nodes marked reinforcement points, and small clusters of symbols flickered where previous engineers had left their marks. Garrett leaned closer. Well now, that's interesting. Wraith, who had been standing near the observation window, stepped back toward the table. What did you find? Garrett rotated the hologram with 2 fingers. Several faint etchings appeared along the inside of the torso plating. These aren't structural marks, he said. Wraith studied the display. They are ceremonial. Garrett nodded slowly. Yeah, that's what I thought. The markings formed a narrow ring along the inside of the armor where the chest plate met the core housing. Each symbol was small, almost hidden, as if whoever engraved them had not intended for them to be easily noticed. Garrett zoomed in. There are 12 of them. Wraith folded her arms. 12 queens. Garrett blinked. Wait. He turned his head toward her. 12? Yes. Garrett pointed toward the long list of names engraved along the outer plating. There are more than 12 names on the armor. Wraith nodded once. Not all queens chose to leave their mark here. Garrett scratched his beard thoughtfully. So the ones who did... Wraith's voice softened slightly. They were the ones who believed the armor carried the burden of leadership. Garrett leaned back in his chair. Well, he said quietly, that explains why this suit feels heavier than it should. Wraith looked at him. The armor weighs only 20 kilograms. Garrett shook his head. I'm not talking about the metal. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the observation window, the station slowly drifted past the glowing atmosphere of the gas giant below. Bands of orange storms rolled across the planet like enormous waves frozen in time. Garrett cleared his throat and leaned forward again. All right, he said. Let's see what secrets you're hiding. He carefully removed another internal plate and set it aside. Beneath it, a cluster of micro-servos revealed themselves, each one smaller than a grain of rice. They shifted slightly as the armor sensed movement, tiny mechanical muscles waiting for commands from a nervous system that was not currently inside the suit. Garrett whistled softly. Still responsive after centuries. Wraith watched the servos move. The armor adapts to each queen. Garrett nodded. I noticed. He pointed to several tiny adjustment brackets along the spine of the frame. These were modified. Yes. Garrett glanced at her. Different body structures? Wraith tilted her head slightly. You are observant. Garrett shrugged. Comes with the job. He tapped the brackets lightly. Your species is similar to humans, but not identical. Wraith's long ears shifted slightly with the motion of her head. Our balance is different. Garrett nodded. Yeah, I figured the ears might affect posture. Wraith looked at him curiously. You studied that? Garrett shrugged again. When a queen stands 2 meters away from you for 6 hours, you start noticing things. Wraith considered that. That is logical. Garrett tightened a stabilizer ring and reconnected a set of energy filaments. The armor hummed faintly as the systems came back online. For a moment, the crystal core flared bright blue, sending a wave of light across the internal structure. Garrett watched the reaction carefully. Well, good news. Wraith waited. Your armor still likes you. Wraith raised an eyebrow. It likes me? Garrett nodded toward the glowing crystal. That reaction happens when the suit detects its owner nearby. Wraith stepped closer to the table. The glow brightened again. Garrett leaned back and crossed his arms. Yep, definitely likes you. Wraith studied the armor quietly. It recognizes its queen. Garrett pointed at the crystal. Pretty sure it recognizes its entire family line. Wraith looked at him. Garrett shrugged. Think about it. He gestured toward the engraved names. This suit has been worn by rulers for generations? Wraith nodded. Yes. Garrett leaned forward slightly. That means the armor has spent centuries listening to the heartbeat of your people's leaders. Wraith's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Garrett tapped the metal lightly. So, yeah, I'm pretty sure it knows exactly who you are. Wraith rested her hand gently against the chest plate. For a moment, the crystal pulsed again, slower this time, almost calm. Garrett watched the glow reflect across the metal. Then he exhaled. You know what? Wraith glanced at him. I think I finally understand something. What? Garrett gestured toward the armor. You don't wear this thing just because it protects you. Wraith said nothing. Garrett leaned back in his chair. You wear it because it reminds you that you're not the first person to carry the responsibility. Wraith's expression remained calm, but her eyes softened slightly. Yes. Garrett nodded. Well, he said quietly, that's a lot of pressure for one suit of armor. Wraith looked down at the glowing metal. It becomes easier when someone else sees the weight. Garrett blinked. You mean me? Wraith looked at him. Yes. Garrett rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Well, that's unfortunate. Wraith's eyebrow lifted slightly. Unfortunate? Garrett nodded. Because now I feel emotionally responsible for making sure this thing survives another few hundred years. Wraith smiled faintly. Garrett looked back at the armor and sighed. Great, he muttered. First I repair it, then he tapped the chest plate lightly. Now apparently I'm part of the history. The armor was quiet, not broken, not dormant, quiet in the way something ancient becomes quiet when its long story pauses between chapters. Garrett wiped a final streak of polishing compound from the chest plate and leaned back from the workbench. The metal reflected the soft blue lights of the station now, smooth and luminous where repairs had been made, yet still marked by the long scars he had refused to erase. He studied it for a moment. Well, he said finally, I think we're done. The repair drones hovered nearby as if waiting for a dramatic announcement. One of them projected the final diagnostic grid above the armor. No red warnings, no structural faults. Only clean, flowing energy lines moving through the suit like calm rivers of light. Garrett folded his arms and nodded with quiet satisfaction. Good. Behind him, Queen Wraith stepped forward. The armor responded immediately. The crystal core deep within the chest housing pulsed softly, sensing her presence again. Lines of pale blue light traveled along the inner channels, awakening systems that had waited patiently through hours of repair. Garrett glanced at the glow. See? It's excited. Wraith stood beside the workbench, studying the restored armor. You repaired everything. Garrett scratched his beard. Technically. Wraith looked at him. Technically? Garrett pointed at a long blade scar across the shoulder. I left some things. Wraith followed his finger. Yes. Garrett shrugged. Seemed wrong to erase them. Wraith rested her hand lightly on the armor. That was wise. Garrett tapped the edge of the workbench. Besides, if I removed all the damage, historians would start asking uncomfortable questions. Wraith tilted her head slightly. What questions? Garrett grinned. Like why the ancient royal armor suddenly looks like it just came out of a factory. Wraith studied the metal again, her fingers tracing one of the older scars. These marks matter. Garrett nodded. Exactly. He leaned forward and pressed a final command into the console. The clamps around the armor released with a soft, magnetic sigh. For a moment, the suit simply rested there, complete. Wraith stepped closer. Garrett stepped aside. Well, he said, gesturing toward it, your armor awaits. Wraith stood before the workbench for a long moment without moving. The quiet hum of the station surrounded them while distant stars drifted slowly past the observation window. Then she began putting the armor on. The process was surprisingly fluid. Sections of the suit unfolded as she approached, the micro-actuators awakening as if greeting an old companion. The chest plate sealed against the inner frame, The shoulder plates slid smoothly into place, and the crystalline core flared briefly as it synchronized with her body. Garrett watched the entire sequence with open fascination. "Okay," he muttered. Wraith glanced at him. "That was impressive." Garrett pointed. "Most armor requires help from at least 2 assistants and a manual." Wraith flexed her fingers as the gauntlets sealed around her hands. "This armor knows its queen." Garrett nodded slowly. "Yeah, I'm starting to believe that." The suit finished locking into place with a soft, harmonic tone. The glow within the crystal dimmed to a steady pulse, perfectly synchronized with Wraith's heartbeat. She stood taller now, the armor reflecting the starlight from the window. Ancient, powerful, alive with history. Garrett crossed his arms and examined his work like a mechanic inspecting a finished engine. "Well," he said, "no explosions so far." Wraith turned toward him. "You expected explosions?" Garrett shrugged. "With technology this old, it's always a possibility." Wraith stepped closer. The armor moved flawlessly with her. "You treated it with respect." Garrett rubbed the back of his neck. "I tried." Wraith looked down at the chest plate, where the engravings of past queens still rested beneath the polished surface. "For centuries," she said quietly, "this armor reminded its wearer of the burden they carried alone." Garrett leaned against the workbench. "Yeah, I noticed the pattern." Wraith looked back at him. "But today someone else acknowledged that weight." Garrett blinked. Well, he shifted awkwardly. "That's part of the job description." Wraith studied him with quiet amusement. "Is it?" Garrett pointed at the armor. "If I'm repairing something that important, I figure I should understand it first." Wraith was silent for a moment. Then she inclined her head slightly. "My people will remember your work." Garrett immediately raised both hands. "Please don't put my name on the armor." Wraith looked confused. "Why?" Garrett laughed. "Because the moment you engrave my name next to a bunch of legendary queens, historians are going to spend centuries arguing about who the confused human technician was." Wraith's shoulders moved slightly with quiet laughter. Garrett looked at the armor again. "You know something?" Wraith waited. "For a while, I thought this suit was just a symbol." Wraith tilted her head. "And now?" Garrett tapped the metal gently. "Now I think it's more like a conversation across time." Wraith looked down at the engravings again. "Yes." Garrett smiled faintly. "And now you're the one continuing it." Wraith stood silently for a moment. Then she turned toward the doorway. The armor moved with silent precision, the ancient systems now stronger than they had been in years. Before leaving, she paused. "Human." Garrett looked up. "Yes, Your Majesty." Wraith's eyes held a faint glimmer of amusement. "You repaired a queen." Garrett blinked. "I repaired the armor." Wraith smiled. Then she stepped into the corridor beyond the workshop, the ancient suit carrying her forward once more toward war, leadership, and the long road of history. Garrett watched her go. After a moment, he sighed and picked up his empty coffee mug. "Well," he muttered to the repair drones, "that's definitely going on my resume."